Good evening and welcome to the second lecture of the 2021 History Lecture Series at the University of Washington. My name is Adam Warren and I am an associate professor in the Department of History. I am delighted that you are all here, even if here is a video conferencing platform and we cannot be together in person. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that while this event takes place virtually, it is being filmed, transmitted, and in many cases viewed on the historic and contemporary lands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, and Muckleshoot nations and other Coast Salish peoples who call the waters and coastlines of the Salish Sea home. As all of you know, the theme of this year's History Lecture Series is technology and its discontents. While we developed the theme last year with a clear sense that the series would revisit ideas equating technology with progress and consider technology's sometimes problematic impact on our world, last night it was technology itself that expressed its own discontent. As one of our colleagues dryly stated, tech happens. That said, we are extremely grateful to our audience for their patience and understanding, and to our tech team. We would like to remind you that the first talk and all other talks in this series will be made available on YouTube, and that last night's attendees have by now received an email with a link to Professor Thomas's complete talk. This evening, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our speaker, Professor Vicente Rafael. A leading historian of Southeast Asia, Professor Rafael came to the University of Washington in 2003, having served previously on the faculty at the University of California, San Diego, and the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He received his PhD at Cornell in 1984, where he studied under the political scientist and historian Benedict Anderson, a scholar whose own work did much to shape how historians would think about the origins of nationalism in Southeast Asia and beyond. Trying to sum up the range of Professor Rafael's scholarly work is a daunting task. As his talk tonight will demonstrate, his research challenges and defies in the best ways the traditional categories that have long been used to organize and map out different areas of historical study. Trained in Southeast Asian history, European intellectual history, and anthropology, Professor Rafael is a scholar who focuses on both the colonial and post-colonial Philippines and the United States, often emphasizing connections between them. As a graduate student training in Latin American history in the late 1990s, I found Professor Rafael's early work on the Spanish colonial Philippines immensely helpful for thinking comparatively about Spanish colonialism in Peru and the Andes, the region that is the focus of my research. His first book, Contracting Colonialism, Translation and Christian Conversion in Tagalog Society Under Early Spanish Rule, draws on history, anthropology, and post-colonial theory to analyze the role of language and translation in facilitating the conversion of Tagalog speakers to Christianity during the 16th and 17th centuries. Arguably, through this analysis, he demonstrates how translation served as a technology of evangelization and colonization that solidified the presence of the Catholic Church and the Spanish crown in the Philippines. Professor Rafael's subsequent publications have continued to theorize questions of language and power and analyze the politics and techniques of translation across a broad time period. Through this approach, he provides readers with a much deeper understanding of the practices and experiences of US colonialism in the Philippines, the emergence and history of Filipino nationalism, the rise of a Filipino diaspora to the United States and other parts of the world, the return to authoritarian rule in the Philippines under current President Rodrigo Duterte, and Americans' own complex relationship with language. His work has also examined the social history of media and mediation and has much to say about race and gender. All of these areas of analysis reflect a desire to theorize communicative acts of various kinds and to interrogate how they operate, something that comes across in tonight's presentation on photography as a technology of communication, one that makes claims to objective representation, but in fact does so much more. As his colleague, my admiration for Professor Rafael stems from many things, but foremost among them are his passion for the pursuit of knowledge and his focus on how the study of the past can inform broader questions and movements for social justice. I can assure you that both of these qualities come across in this evening's talk. While we are listening and during the discussion at the end, please feel free to enter questions you may have in the Q&A feature on Zoom. You may also upvote questions already posed that you would like to see answered. And with that, it is my pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Rafael to the virtual stage to present Photographic Power, Tales from the Philippines and the United States.
Thank you so much, Adam, for that very, very generous introduction. And thank you for the rest of the technical crew in the history department for putting together this talk. The title for my talk tonight, Photographic Power, takes its inspiration from a series of addresses given by the former slave and radical abolitionist Frederick Douglass during the height of the American Civil War between 1861 and 1865. Entitled Pictures and Progress, Douglass, in the midst of the war, hailed the promise of photography to bring forth democratic modes of representation. Comparing the invention of the daguerreotype of his day to that of the printing press, the steamship, and the train, he saw in photography the power to bring distances up close and level social hierarchies by revealing the common humanity of those below with those above. Quote, "Men of all conditions and classes can now see themselves as others see them, as they will be seen by those who shall come after them. What was once the special and exclusive luxury of the rich and the great is now the privilege of all. The humblest servant girl may now possess a picture of herself such as the wealth of kings could not purchase 50 years ago," close quote. Describing human beings as picture-making animals, Douglass saw in photography the vindication of the brotherhood of men. By enabling this universal capacity for picture-making, photography would allow humans an objective view of themselves. It would permit them to draw a distance from the subjective and often conflicting versions others have of them, and give them a chance to take a full measure of their actual being apart from accepted opinions. Thus would photography create a means for the criticism of both the self and the world. And it was this capacity for objectification and self-criticism that, according to Douglass, would lead to progress. Douglass, however, hedged his optimistic view about photography's power with the following caution, quote, "This picture-making faculty is flung out into the world like others, capable of being harnessed to the car of truth or error. It is a vast power to whatever cause it is coupled. For the habit we adopt, the master we obey, in making our subjective nature objective, giving it form, color, space, action, and utterance, is the one important thing to ourselves and our surroundings. It will either lift us to the highest heaven or sink us to the lowest depths, for good and evil know no limits." In other words, the vast power of photography to act upon the actions of others and to change our perception about one another also comes with great danger. It can reveal the truth, but it can also foster error depending on the master we obey. It is this double-edged power of photography, its capacity to objectify and distort, to reveal and falsify, to further oppression, but also seek emancipation, that I would like to explore tonight. We can think about the dialectical workings of photographic images in several ways, but in the interest of time, I'd like to limit myself to three genres. First, that of portraiture; second, war photography; and third, what we might think of as civil rights and civil wrongs. And I would like to do so comparatively, toggling between certain historical moments in the United States and its former colony, the Philippines. First, let's begin with portraiture and return to Frederick Douglass, who, as many of you know, was the most photographed man in the 19th century, totaling over 160 portraits. Douglas avidly sought to have his portrait taken throughout his entire life. A brief perusal of his pictures shows him aging, but constantly striking the same pose of forceful dignity. Always dressed impeccably, his portraits suggest an inner rationality capable of seeing itself objectively and self-critically. In this way, Douglas was countering the racist depictions of African Americans who had long been stereotyped in popular entertainment, such as minstrel shows, ethnological studies, and philosophical accounts, as inherently irrational, servile, and fit only to serve whites. As the historian Laura Wexler writes, quote, "Rather than masks of abjection imposed upon a former slave, the Douglas portraits are a different kind of social cover. They are signs of distinction assumed deliberately by a man who had formerly been denied it. The series of Douglas's images displays what an isolated image or a single moment in time cannot: the vital, active, subtle, informed, and determined will of an individual who had been born and raised as chattel," close quote. Douglas was not the only former slave who took great care of crafting photographic images. Another great abolitionist, Sojourner Truth, similarly had her portraits taken and reproduced in carte de visite. She sold this during her lecture appearances, inscribing them with the following: "I sell the shadow to support the substance." As with Douglas, Truth harnessed the power of photography to disseminate a set of counterclaims about herself and those she spoke for. Projecting herself as self-possessed, her photographs refused the possessive investments of whites in Black property. And by selling her shadow, she asserted her right to control her appearance and use it as a means for abolishing rather than profiting from slavery. Similarly, the leading Black intellectual of the later 19th century, W.E.B. Du Bois, seized upon the genre of portraiture to exhibit several photo albums of Georgia's African American community in the Paris Exposition of 1900. Set against the backdrop of Jim Crow lynchings, the 360 photographs gathered by Du Bois show Black men and women dressed in their finest clothes and refined bourgeois interiors. Their images, in effect, subverted the reigning stereotypes of Blacks, seen in mugshots, ethnological studies, and most damaging of all, as the abject victims of lynching at the hands of white mobs. They thus collectively function as a kind of counter-archive that challenges a long legacy of racist taxidermy, as Shawn Michelle Smith has put it. Just as Du Bois declared the color line to be the problem of the 20th century, so did he turn to photography, seeking to move Blacks out of the shadow cast by white supremacy and into the substance of Black lives that mattered. At this point, I want to shift the angle of vision and cast it across the Pacific to the Philippines. We can see the same photographic power at work in the images of early nationalists from the late 19th century. Notable examples include Jose Rizal and his generation of cosmopolitan exiles in Spain and other parts of Europe working towards reforming the Spanish colony between the 1880s and 1890s. Born in 1861, on the same year as the start of the Civil War, and Douglas's earliest version of his address, Pictures and Progress, Rizal was part of an emergent colonial bourgeoisie who benefited from the agricultural revolution of the 1820s and the subsequent opening up of the colony to world trade. Yet, despite their university education, their fluency in Spanish and other languages, and their material wealth, they faced persistent racial assaults by Spanish officials and clergy who regarded them as physically weak, morally corrupt, and incapable of rational thought. To disprove these Spanish assumptions, nationalists engaged in a sustained campaign for reforms. In this regard, photography played a role in nationalist attempts to craft counter-arguments against Spanish racism. Take, for example, the photograph of Rizal with the two other nationalists in Madrid, Mariano Ponce and Marcelo H. del Pilar, writers for the nationalist newspaper La Solidaridad. One could think of this photograph as a larger attempt at Filipino self-fashioning. By posing, as they inevitably did, in European clothes, they appear tendentiously out of context. Their photographed bodies take visible exception to Spanish stereotypes that often infantilized Filipino men, who were said to be, quote, lacking even the beard, which is the sign of the virility of a race. Bodies without clothes, brains without ideas, an inanimate heap of entities, close quote. By contrast, these photographs show an intense seriousness of expression on the Filipinos' faces that makes one think, as with the portraits of Douglas, Truth, and those of Du Bois's albums, of collected interiors in command of their exterior representation, of minds in charge of their bodies, appropriating European fashion for decolonizing ends. One more example of the decolonizing potential of photography can be seen in the most widely circulated portrait of Rizal. Shortly before and long after his death by firing squad in 1896 on charges of fomenting the Philippine Revolution, Rizal's portrait took on an iconic quality. Taken in Madrid in 1890, it was widely reproduced. Smaller copies circulated with the outbreak of the revolution, bearing such legends as, quote, Dr. Jose Rizal, tyranny snatched you away from us, but what it will never do is to erase you from the hearts of your countrymen, close quote. Indeed, his photos were often displayed in the secret meeting places of the Katipunan, the revolutionary organization that emerged in 1892, dedicated to carrying out an armed uprising against Spain. For many Filipinos, then, the portrait of Rizal functioned as a basis for visualizing a history of the future. As the passage indicates above, his photograph took on a kind of totemic significance, becoming a cult object pointing to an alternative realm of power and redemption. Now, aside from portraiture, where else can we see the power of photography at work? One area is in war. The camera, like the gun, has long been intimately connected to war since the 1850s. During the American Civil War, for example, photographs sought to convey the destruction and desolation of the war, bringing distant battlefields up close to those at home. In this way, photographs made the war seem immediate and close at hand. They were regarded as authentic depictions of the war's realities. The attraction to authenticity is reflected in the comments of such observers as Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said, quote, let him who wishes to know what war is look at this series of illustrations, referring to Matthew Brady's exhibit of photographs of Antietam. Here, the camera, regarded as a technology for witnessing the truth, a truth that had at its core the deaths of opposing soldiers as well as those who were caught up in the battle. Photographs by Matthew Brady, Timothy O'Sullivan, and Andrew Gardner were famously regarded as what war really is, with its images of officers and battlefields, but most especially with its views of the war dead. In such photographs as The Harvest of War and others like it, we get a disturbing sense of a landscape, yielding not crops, but corpses as far as the eye can see. Populated by death, what would have been a pastoral scene is converted into an uncanny sight of the deadly effects of war. Yet, as other scholars have pointed out, the truth of war comes through by way of a process of dissimulation and distortion. The camera's claim of conveying the truth and depicting authenticity was invariably compromised. For example, many Civil War battle scenes were photographed long after the fact, and the scenes of death were composed to show whole rather than dismembered bodies. At times, corpses were dragged several feet away from where they originally fell and set up to paint, as it were, an allegorical scene of the tragedy of the war. Confederate and Union soldiers were often mislabeled. Seeking to evoke pathos, photographers resorted to staging some of their pictures. Reframing the scenes of war meant as the historian Elizabeth Young wrote, that, quote, at the moment of foundational authenticity, the battlefield photograph was already a form of reenactment, close quote. Indeed, the very reason for the war, the abolition of slavery, is systematically erased in these photographs. Images of African Americans very rarely appear, and if they do, they are depicted in marginal and servile poses. Instead, Civil War photographs reposition the conflict as a battlefield between white men and a fratricidal war between the North and the South, where the crucial role of Black soldiers is wholly ignored. The so-called authenticity of the photographs lay precisely in their reenactment of war as a crisis in white male supremacy, rather than as the death struggle to abolish slavery. Now, we could gloss these images of the Civil War as a fratricidal war among white men to the exclusion of Blacks as symptomatic of the symbolic and internal amputation of the Union. While images of the battlefield did not show the dismembered remains of soldiers, there was one area of Civil War photography that did: medical photos of amputated bodies of soldiers. In 1862, the Surgeon General ordered the taking of photographs of injured soldiers for teaching and research purposes. One of the notable pioneers of medical photography was the Union surgeon Reed Bontekoe, who accumulated a huge archive of photographs of his wounded patients. With their detailed annotations, these images circulated in hospitals, exhibited in expositions, and used as evidence by soldiers to make claims for pensions. Working at a hospital in Washington, D.C. in 1863, Bontekoe's photographs are mostly that of amputees. This is not surprising, since amputation was the most common surgical procedure used by doctors then. Over 60,000 soldiers went through amputation, and around 45,000 survived. Losing limbs thus became a common experience among soldiers on both sides of the conflict. Its visual evidence lay in the quote-unquote empty sleeve, the loose sleeve that hung from either side of the arm or the leg of the soldier, testifying to the great sacrifice they had rendered to their cause. The disabled white male soldier thus became for a moment the symbol for the shattered nation. But thanks to the development of prosthetic technology in the North, the lost limbs of war could be compensated. The injured body could once again be made to seem whole. Photographic and prosthetic technologies work to display as well as to disavow the destruction of war, suggesting how a shared disability could give way to the shared recovery of the body politic. Together, these two technologies reaffirmed the image projected by Civil War photographs, that the war was really about the white nation torn asunder, but now capable of reuniting from the ravages of conflict, thanks in part to Yankee ingenuity. Of course, such a reunification was, as many other historians have noted, carried out at the expense of Black bodies. The abolition of slavery led to new forms of violent oppression and exclusion of Blacks, especially with the end of Reconstruction. In a sense, Blacks were the other bodies that were left amputated in the process of unification. Rather than receive the prostheses that would have enabled them to participate as able-bodied citizens in the post-war republic, they continued to be subjected to unrelenting mutilation and dismemberment as a condition for sustaining the social wholeness of white bodies. The most visceral proof of Black dismemberment can be seen in the history of lynching. Integral to the practice of Jim Crow, lynching was a common means for enforcing segregation, especially in the face of white fears of miscegenation and the economic competition in the South as well as in the North. Photographs of lynching offer uncommonly painful evidence of the ways the torture and evisceration of Black bodies formed the material and symbolic grounds for the formation of white social identity. as we see in such films as Birth of a Nation, often heralded as the most technologically advanced film of its time, to the postcards collected by James Allen in his book and exhibit No Sanctuary, the lynching of blacks became not only normalized, but celebrated and commercialized by whites. It entailed what Elizabeth Alexander called, quote, violence made spectacular, a form of ritualized extrajudicial killing that was relished by whites as a way of enforcing racial and sexual hierarchies that for them was endangered by the very possibility of black freedom. As exercises in direct popular justice, lynchings were often broadcast and attended by hundreds, at times thousands of whites from all walks of life. They became occasions to assert cross-class, intergenerational solidarity amid the charred, mutilated corpses of black victims. Thus did white supremacy emerge from an imagined community predicated on the ability to control the life and death of the accursed other. We can think of images of lynching as the other side of Civil War photography. They suggest a continuation of war by other means, foregrounding what were systematically excluded from the latter, the spectacle of black death productive of white life. The visual historian Shawn Michelle Smith has drawn our attention to the images of white mobs congregating in the aftermath of a lynching as if it were a form of mass entertainment. They often appear, these white mobs, in a celebratory mood, smiling, dressed as if to go out for the weekend. Images of the crowd include both men and women, and most strikingly of all, children. The presence of children makes it seem as if adults treated lynching as teachable moments, whose lessons and legacy of white violence were being passed from one generation to the next. Finally, Smith reminds us that lynching photographs were also distributed as mass-produced postcards. Photographers set up temporary printing shops near the site of the killings, and crowds avidly bought and sent photographs to their friends and family. Rendered as postcards, lynching served as a technology for connecting whites across great distances. As Ashraf Rushdi has argued, perhaps anticipating right-wing news and internet outlets today, quote, one group of white people gathered around a burned black body was communicating to another group in another county. They had done their part, asserted their place in the world, close quote. The commerce in lynching photographs thus provided souvenirs that could be shared widely, suggesting that, as Smith writes, lynching itself was a reproducible act, rendering benign the exercise and effects of white terror on black lives. Now, lynching photographs, however, was not merely a way of projecting white supremacy. They also became an important means for protesting lynching itself. In the hands of anti-lynching activists, they were used to expose the brutality of white mobs. We can see this in the work of the most important anti-lynching activist, Ida B. Wells. In her reports and speeches, Wells turned to the indexical capacity of photography to cite what actually happened as a way of supporting statistics, investigative reports, and accounts from the press. Lynching photographs attached to her reports served as evidence to prove that blacks were the real victims and white mobs were the perpetrators. Just as significant, Wells included portraits of herself, carefully composed and dressed to show her audiences an image of a dignified black womanhood that was radically different from the existing stereotypes. Finally, she made it a point in some of her publications to include photographs of herself posing with the family of the lynched victims. It was a way of showing that lynching was not just a crime against the individual victim, but also against her kin. It destroyed not just the individual black life, but also of those of many others connected to the victim. Such family photographs recontextualize the image of the black victim as part of a larger network of affection and care shattered by white terror. While lynching postcards linked whites with one another, photographs of the family of the lynched victim revealed something of the terrible price extracted from black families for this racial kinship. Photographic power thus can turn against the original users and allow those below to speak out against the crimes of those above. Now, what about the Philippines? Can we also see the same aesthetics and politics of photography at play in the archipelago? Closely related to lynching photographs were photographs of the Filipino-American War, which lasted from around 1899 to 1902 and somewhat beyond. Owing to the availability of smaller handheld cameras, journalists and soldiers produced a wide-ranging archive of images of the war at the turn of the century. Most striking of all, at least in my opinion, were photographs of the Filipino War dead. As far as I know, no photos of dead Americans exist, where Civil War photos focused on white bodies as symbols of nationhood, and while lynching photos framed black deaths as the triumph of white lives, the images of the Filipino-American War focused on dead Filipinos, framing the war as a racial struggle that inevitably resulted in white mastery of natives. There are numerous photographs of native corpses left out on the roadside, corpses lined up for mass burial, corpses on hillsides, and corpses in mass graves. The circulation of these photographs were fairly widespread, appearing in private albums, official colonial reports, newspaper accounts, and popular narratives of the war. At one point, anti-imperialists in Boston were also given to displaying these photographs as a way of decrying the brutality of the war. How do we read these photographs? What kinds of truths do they embed? As I mentioned earlier, photos of dead Filipinos functioned analogously to lynching photographs. They were meant to certify the mastery of white soldiers over native fighters. Given the asymmetrical nature of the war, Filipinos resorted to guerrilla warfare based on sporadic engagements, hit-and-run tactics, and techniques of camouflage that rendered Filipino fighters virtually invisible, much to the frustration of U.S. soldiers. Photographing them dead meant making visible what could not previously be seen, fixing their once mobile bodies into a set of unchanging images. Such images consolidate the memory of a prior confrontation. They were meant to prove less the skill of Filipino fighters as the courage of North Americans who, in setting aside their fear of death, showed themselves capable of risking their lives and taking the lives of others. But such risks, in order to enter into history, had to be acknowledged. Photographing the dead was a way to secure such recognition from those who survived the war. For this reason, photos of Filipino dead completed the arc of Civil War photos, which sought to portray white soldiers from the North and South joined together in common cause to conquer a foreign enemy thousands of miles away. But to photograph corpses also meant to keep them alive after a fashion. Unlike lynching photos, images of the Filipino dead show them whole rather than buried and mutilated. Nonetheless, they come across as ghastly remains of racist violence, the decimated remains of a native enemy. As with lynching photos, war photos of the dead served as mechanically reproducible mementos, some of which were also printed in postcards and sent home, while others were published in newspapers and magazines. They preserved the shock of war, even as they rendered the shock benign and thereby allowed its assimilation into everyday life. Left unmourned, images of the native dead can be swept aside. In this way, the trauma of the Filipino-American War, which killed over 250,000 Filipinos, can be forgotten, cleanly amputated, as it were, from the history of the U.S. empire, as it often is, and buried in the depths of the imperial archive. Several decades later, these images would be replaced by striking photographs of other wars, such as those from World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the never-ending wars against terror. Most of these, especially taken in Vietnam, would be used by anti-war movement to protest the war. Photographic power was used once again to counter the claims of those above by showing the sufferings and deaths of those below. However, this did not happen in the Filipino-American War, except briefly among the Anti-Imperialist League. Filipinos themselves never used these photographs. On the whole, the horrors of war, along with its troubling images, were largely forgotten, not only by Americans, but by Filipinos themselves. In this case, photography linked to colonial rule promoted not remembering, but rather forgetting. Why was this the case? How does photography succeed in conveying the trauma of racist violence and imperialist war in some cases, but fail to do so in others? Why is it that photographs of traumatic events can mobilize protest and opposition in some contexts, but suppress and silence such responses in other cases? One answer, of course, has to do with the fact that photographs by themselves are not capable of making changes by themselves. They require interpretation. They need to be framed and deployed, explained and contested. In other words, photographs, like all images, make sense only insofar as they are seen to be part of what the visual theorist Ariella Azoulay calls the social contract that requires the interaction of the photographer, the subject being photographed, and the indeterminate viewers who feel themselves, for whatever reason, called upon to respond to the photograph and to continue its work. To think of the photograph as a social contract is as to see it not as a thing, but as a social relationship, a form of practical engagement with the world. To see how this social contract of photography works, I want to move into the last section of my presentation, civil rights and civil wrongs. Some of the most compelling examples of photography as a social contract can be found in images of the American Civil Rights Movement. Take, for example, the photographs related to the murder of Emmett Till. The story is familiar. In 1955, a 14-year-old boy from Chicago was sent by his mother to live for a summer with some relatives in Money, Mississippi. Accused by a white woman of making advances at a local store, the nature of which remains unclear, Till was subsequently kidnapped by her husband and two friends. He was beaten and shot in the head. His body was thrown into the river, weighed down by a large metal cotton gin fan tied to his neck with a barbed wire. Days later, his body was recovered, horribly decomposed and unrecognizable. Rather than keep his casket closed during his wake at a Chicago church, his mother, Mamie Till Bradley, decided to leave it open to, quote, make the whole world see, as she says, what they had done to her son. Over the course of 4 days, thousands of people came to view the casket, shocked at what they saw. The black press, such as Jet and the Chicago Defender, published photographs of Till's body, badly disfigured. They published photographs of Till's badly disfigured face, which was picked up by other newspapers, focusing on the racial violence of the South. Till's murderers had bragged about killing him. They were eventually arrested and tried, but an all-white male jury found them innocent, agreeing with the defense that the body fished out of the Tallahatchie River could not definitively be identified as that of Emmett Till. His severely maimed face thus resulted in two radically different interpretations. From the perspective of the white jury, what they saw was not Till, but some other unknowable body decimated beyond recognition. It was indistinguishable from the trash and detritus that lay under the river. But for the thousands who filed by his casket and even greater numbers who saw the photographs of his violated face, their reactions were far more visceral. They had no doubt that this was indeed Emmett Till, whose face bore the traces of the long history of white violence against blacks. In news stories, his distorted face was often paired with another photograph of him, smiling, dressed in his hat and tie. The contrast could not have been more jarring. As Shawn Michelle Smith notes, African Americans who lived during the time of Till's murder often speak of the photograph that jolted them into recognizing the historic importance of lynching's cultural logic. The paired images of Till incited outrage among African Americans and helped catalyze the growing civil rights movement in the United States. They provided a kind of visual shorthand that aroused and inspired African Americans to action. Viewers saw in Till's photographs not only the brutality of white racism, but also the efficacy of photography and the mass media as tools of political change. Now, Till's mother, by insisting on exposing her son's beaten body, appended the conventions of both portraiture and lynching photographs. The former was meant to reveal the unassailable dignity within the subject, while the latter was meant to announce the triumph of whites over blacks. In Emmett Till's photographs, we see the image of brutal defacement as both a metaphor and a metonymy for the systematic violation of an entire people, as well as the indictment of Jim Crow. Those who were angered and affected by images of Till's defacement found themselves participating in the social contract of photography. They were moved into action, heeding its call to respond and take responsibility for what they saw. Rather than react passively, they continued the work of drawing out the implications of the photograph and sorting through its meaning to arrive at a logical conclusion. In doing so, they followed in the wake of Mammy Till Bradley, who said, quote, "They had to see what I had seen. The whole nation had to bear witness to this," close quote. Put differently, those who saw Till's photographs heard the cry it sent forth, beginning with the cry of his mother. Bearing witness meant seeing as well as hearing the sound from the gaping wound in Till's body and the history it instantiated. Grieving for Emmett Till meant mourning his death and those of others who came before him, but it also meant listening to, then echoing the rage and sadness that surrounds and permeates the photograph, an echoing that the cultural theorist Fred Moten calls moaning. This is the sound, he says, this is the sound before the photograph, scream inside and out of the image, redoubled and reanimating passion, the passion of a seeing that is involuntary and uncontrollable, a seeing that redoubles itself as sound, a passion that is the redoubling of Emmett Till's passion. Black moaning is the phonographic content of this photograph. The meaning of a photograph is cut and augmented by a sound or noise that surrounds it and pierces its frame. It is the sound of moaning in excess of the rituals of mourning that underlies, Moten argues, the aesthetics and politics of Black arts, which is to say Black lives, from the gospel to the blues, from the soaring falsetto of Al Green to the tortured beauty of the music of John Coltrane and Charlie Mingus. Resonating within and beyond the image of Till's defaced image, it is a, quote, complex, dissonant, polyphonic drive, the sound of resistance and the struggle for justice. It signals the arrival of what Moten calls, quote, a new word and a new world. It is arguably this conjunction of the visual and the auditory that similarly animates the current movement of the current moment of the Black Lives Matter movement. Videos capturing the extrajudicial murder of Blacks by police continue as much as they intensify the trauma of slavery and Jim Crow lynching, as in the case of Emmett Till. The sight and sound of police brutality exercised on Black bodies brings to mind the history of lynching and exposes the white supremacist logic underlying much of law enforcement in this country. One sees the violence and hears the cry, "I can't breathe." Mourning and moaning, one is drawn to respond and take responsibility, acting upon the actions of others to forge alliances and seek a new social contract in search of racial justice. Now, I'm running out of time, so I want to end with one final comparison with the Philippines. While the country's racial and class politics differ significantly from the United States, there are moments in its history where photographic images, as we've seen earlier, resonate loudly. One such pivotal moment took place during the martial law years of the dictator Ferdinand Marcos. In August of 1893, his chief opponent, Benigno Ninoy Aquino, decided to return from exile in Boston to convince Marcos, who was then seriously ill from lupus, to end martial law. He never got the chance. Landing at the airport, he was led by members of the military and assassinated as he climbed down the stairs. Photos and videos of his slain body dressed in white arms outstretched as if crucified on the airport tarmac, were widely circulated. During his wake, his mother, as in the case of Mammy Till Bradley, insisted that his corpse be left untouched and his casket remain open to show the world what the dictatorship had done to him. His bloodied and bloated face horrified the thousands who came to pay their respects, furnishing for many the most compelling evidence of the barbarity of the Marcos regime. A huge crowd attended Aquino's funeral, which was held in a raging typhoon that flooded much of Manila. It turned out to be the largest demonstration of the Marcos regime. Politicizing grief, those who joined in the funeral were moved not just by his death, but also by the images of the regime's violence left on his face. Trauma was transformed into resolve. And 3 years later, in February of 1986, a civilian-backed coup known as People Power overthrew the Marcoses, sending them to exile in the United States. Such a victory, however, was short-lived and for many quickly set aside. Succeeding administrations eventually opened the door for the return and a restoration of the very figures and forces that supported and sustained martial law. The Marcoses themselves were allowed back in, their billions in plunder left intact, and oligarchs, both new and old, once again established their social, political, and economic hegemony. All of this has culminated in the rise of President Rodrigo Duterte to power in 2016, the same year as Donald Trump's elections, whose rule has been distinguished by his unrestrained war on drugs. Numerous photographs of victims of the drug war, now totaling over 7,000 by official count, as well as their families, have flooded local and international media. Yet, nothing like a Black Lives Matter movement has arisen in response to these images of extrajudicial killings. For reasons too complicated to enter into at this moment, dramatic and sorrowful photographs of the drug war dead and their grieving families have not translated into a cry for the overthrow of Duterte as Aquino's bloodied corpse had in the case of Marcos. Instead, after meeting with initial outrage, these images gave way to a generalized sense of fear, providing evidence of the regime's relentless impunity. Paralysis, rather than protest, followed in the face of the defaced images of the dead. Photography in this case has led to a concerted has led less to a concerted opposition as to a consolidation of Duterte's power. Its function as an instrument of witnessing with which to archive injustice and call for redress seems to have been stymied, at least for now. Hence, we see in the Philippines a radically different development compared to the United States. Rather than provoke the search for a new world, a new social contract, the work of photography has had unintended conservative effects. Its critical and mobilizing potential has been arrested by the state. Images of the dead, as in the case of the Filipino-American, were seen, yet left unseen, for fear of what they might reveal. The keening lamentations of their families have been silenced, left unheard and unvindicated. For this reason, Duterte continues to enjoy considerable popularity among the people who succumb to the fear of death and seek security under his rule. Unlike Trump, he faces no danger of being impeached, much less effectively challenged in the near future. But the future is as near as it is always more than we can know, much less anticipate. And we can be certain that as the future unfolds in surprising and perhaps prophetic ways, photography, understood in its broadest sense as a collaborative social practice that involves photographers, subjects, and viewers, will be there to capture it and archive its material traces for others to see and hear, to interpret and act upon. In this way, the power of photography to bind and unbind, to provoke and move, to reveal truth but also to foment error remains. As Frederick Douglass rightly predicted over 156 years ago, quote, "It will either lift us into the highest heaven or sink us to the lowest depths. For good and evil know no limits." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Rafael, for that really powerful and moving talk. I think there's so much material here for us to ponder, and I think you've done such a beautiful job of showing why images that are troubling are important to look at and to think about and historicize. So thank you so much for this talk. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and I would encourage audience members who have questions to please enter them into the Q&A feature on Zoom. I will take the opportunity as moderator to ask the first question. So Vince, in your talk, you talked about photographs as having the potential, the possibility of mobilizing protest, and in some cases silencing resistance and reinforcing the state or sort of the powers that be. And this comes across really beautifully at the end of your talk, where you talk about Black Lives Matter, you talk about the earlier struggle against the Marcos regime in the Philippines in the 1980s, and you contrast both of those with the current situation under Duterte in the Philippines, and the way in which photography and photographs of the horrors of the drug war in many cases have many ways have reinforced Duterte's hold on power. I was wondering if you could think out loud a little bit about what the conditions might be in the Philippines to enable some kind of change. What would need to happen for photography to take on a different purpose or have a different consequence?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. As I mentioned earlier, we need to think about photography not just as a thing, but as a part of a larger set of social relations. And that for photography to work, it requires the interpretive work between viewers, photographers, subjects that are being photographed. In that sense, it requires the creation of a new social contract. Now, a new social contract, of course, needs to be attached to and connected to social opposition, institutions of caring and sharing. And those institutions have always existed in places like the Philippines, as they have in the United States, but at the moment have been sort of suppressed. And that many of those who you would think would be part of this oppositional movements have shied away. So the answer to your question is it will depend on the prospects and the trajectory of opposition movements and what they will do in order to organize a different, what Fred Moten calls a new world, right? And at this moment, that simply hasn't happened, which doesn't mean it won't. It just simply at this moment, the time has not yet arrived. So.
Thank you. So we have several questions that have come into the chat that note the changing nature of photography over the period that you have been discussing, right, from the daguerreotype to the selfie, as it were, and also that mention the moving image, right, video and film as being something different from traditional photography. So if I'm going to try and synthesize these. One question is how is the modern technology of editing, of photoshopping, of fabricating images, such as Photoshop, changed the role of photography in social movements? And then there's a second question that asked you to think about the medium of video and whether that is interpreted in the same or at least a similar way to that of traditional photography. Does video function in the same way as the still photograph?
Yeah, no, that's is enormous literature about that, and I can't possibly cover the differences and similarities between still photography and video photography in 10 seconds. But let me just mention this. I think this is where the comments by Fred Moten about the phonographic and the photographic are very useful. To think about the visual as already implicating the auditory, and the auditory as already productive of the visual. From the very beginning. I think it's a sort of interesting way of saying that the history of photography has always anticipated its technological mutations into video, into all sorts of visual imaging apparatus and so forth and so on, to the extent that voice and sight, hearing and vision are always sort of wrapped up into each other. And I think what modern video technologies have done together is simply bring that out and make it more obvious.
Great. So we have a couple of questions that are about the difference between black and white and color images, and so I'll ask one of them. So the audience member writes, all but the very final images you showed are in black and white. Could you comment on any differences you see in the ability of black and white versus color photography to convey powerful and the powerful and difficult issues you've discussed?
Certainly, these aesthetic considerations have different effects, different impact. I think it's all contingent. I think it all depends. I couldn't imagine watching, for example, film noir movies in anything but black and white, right? Which is why a colorized version of Casablanca just ruins it for you, right? But as I said, it's all of this is really quite contingent, and you'd have to look at specific contexts and specific photographs to determine, well, does it work in black and white or is it better in color, and so forth. So I think the drug war photographs work much better in color. Because a lot of it was taken at night, and the effects are much more visceral. Whereas, it's very hard to imagine Civil War photographs to be anything else but in black and white, or the Emmett Till photographs, for that matter, to be anything else but in black and white. The contrast is just so much more dramatic in that sense.
Yeah. We also have a couple of questions about social media, and one of which has actually come from Facebook. So I'll ask one of them. I'm wondering if you think the ease of sharing photos through social media and the 24-hour news cycle has increased or decreased or not changed the impact of images like these. So in other words, how is social media and sort of the media world we live in changed the way that we experience images?
Again, it's a really difficult question to answer. I think one of two ways to think about it. One is that it's the usual answer is it's sort of desensitized us to a lot of imagery. We're able to look at things like violent imagery, for example, and just simply discount it and feel that they don't really pertain to us. On the other hand, once in a while, depending on the way, I think a lot of it has to do with the way the particular photograph calls to us. Again, I think about the auditory quality of the photographs. The way it calls to us, certain photographs just reach out and demand a response. They demand that we take responsibility for what we see. Other photographs don't do that, or at least not for certain people. So I think it's the same with social media. The excess of imagery once in a while produces conditions that, as for example, in the case of photographs of Black Lives Matter, produce conditions that say, you can't just ignore this. You have to answer to it. You have to do something. It's calling out to you, and that's when you begin to see the workings of what I've been calling the social, what Ariela Azoulay calls the social contract of photography.
So this is a question that goes beyond the Philippines and the United States, but it builds on your mention of the social contract. A viewer asks, might the social contract approach within photography apply to the Japanese occupation in the Commonwealth periods? I guess it is actually about the Philippines. As I think about it,
No, absolutely. I think it applies to any and all photography. Right. There's always that possibility that photographs, to the extent that they take place in such a way that require people to answer for what they see. Whether it's photograph of a beautiful landscape or the photograph of death and destruction during the war, to the extent that it calls out to you, that it begins to forge the possibility of new social relations. That's when photography begins to have a real historical impact. But it's also the case when that possibility is lost, when it disappears. There's no guarantee. In other words, there's no guarantee, and that goes to the very nature of photography, of photographic power as simultaneously sort of arresting, but also quite fragile.
Thank you. So probably have time for two more questions. So one person asks, virtually anyone these days can photograph public events. How has this affected the uses and effects of photos in the US and the Philippines?
You know, of course, the cell phone is the most common way people take photographs these days. And what's that done? It's further democratized the possibility of image making. I mean, it would have delighted Frederick Douglass, you know, because it would have affirmed his notion that what did he say? You know, human beings are picture taking animals, as he calls them. You know, they're drawn to represent. They're drawn to objectify the world that they see, and in the process of objectifying, seek to appropriate them. So I think what these new technologies do is to tap into something, or to create something, to harness something that may in fact be part of the experience of living in the modern world. You know, you could say that you know, if you were to historicize this experience, you might say that, you know, we can't think of modernity without thinking about this image making capacity that modernity seems to instill in us. You know, we want images, we want to make images, we want to draw them closer to us, and photography has sort of tapped into that modern impulse.
Great. So this will be the last question, and I'm actually going to combine two of them. So there is a question that asks whether the information in today's talk has been published in an article or book. But the other question, which was upvoted on Zoom, is looking at troubling photos today, what questions should we ask ourselves to best frame these photos in context?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, that's been the theme of this paper, is that, you know, what is the ethics of looking, right? I mean, what's our responsibility when we see something disturbing? You know, do we first of all, do we take it at face value? Do we assume that this is an authentic or true photograph? You know, given all the different ways that photographs are photoshopped and manipulated and so forth. So we have that responsibility to determine whether or not it's the real thing, or whether or not it's been manipulated. Secondly, the question is, you know, how do we respond to it? How do we take, and responding and taking responsibility, I think, are two sides of the same coin, right? So you know, once we see that the photograph, you know, once we feel or we apprehend the photograph, how do we comprehend its meaning, right? How do we attach it to other parts of our experiences that give it a place in our lives? Or do we just simply dismiss it and say, well, let's move on, I have too much to do today. I can't deal with yet another picture of earthquake victims in, you know, Indonesia or whatever, you know, so.
Great.
It's tough, yeah.
And is the material published somewhere?
Is the material, no, actually, no. I just finished writing it like 2 days ago, so it hasn't been published.
Well, I sense from that question that an audience member looks forward to seeing it in print.
Yeah.
Many thanks again, Professor Rafael, for this fantastic talk, and thank you as well to all of our attendees this evening. We look forward to seeing you again on February 3rd for our third talk by Professor Bruce Hevely, as well as on February 10th for our fourth talk in this series by Professor Margaret Amata. Thank you so much, and good evening.
Thank you.